Why does the government say that they should be separate?
Yeah, it's one of those ones. It's an interesting one because I feel like I've been banging on about this for 4 years in saying that you should be separating SIL and SDA, and that any day now it's going to be enforced.
I mean, they have talked about it for a long time, and it was in the NDIS review that it was again recommended. Do you think we're likely to see it actually legislated?
From a view of people wanting it, absolutely. I think it's an any day sort of thing. There was clearly an appetite. There's clearly been a government appetite when it came down 12 months ago to bring it into force. But the first step has been so slow to getting here. We just don't know as to what sort of reform we're going to see coming up with the NDIS and with the NDIS Act in particular. However slowly it might be, we are moving to a phase where there is going to be a need to have that separation. And now it's a question of what form that separation takes.
Every SIL provider knows the challenges: compliance, rosters, claims. But what if you could work smarter, grow faster, and make a bigger impact? Welcome to SILosophy, where we have real conversations about what it takes to succeed in supported independent living. This podcast is powered by Tania Gomez Consulting and Resolve. Let's get into it.
Welcome to SILosophy. Today I'm joined by Jackson Dyer from DLA Piper. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I wanted to chat to you today a little bit about the separation of SIL and SDA, which is a highly debated topic in the space. But before we jump into that, can you give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and to DLA Piper?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been working in the SDA space as a legal advisor for about 5 years now, working with Tony Rutherford. We've had a few firms, but DLA Piper is where we are at the moment, which has proved to be a really great firm for getting a lot of information and a lot of different approaches on SDA together. So it's not just Tony and I who generally are well across the NDIS space. We have other partners now who are also advising a lot on tax issues and on employment issues as well. So there's a lot of scope that's being developed in DLA at the moment in the SDA space. Wow. But all of that is underpinned, I guess, to an extent by, again, the sort of 5 years experience that I have and the many more years that Tony has in the space.
Yeah, so, wonderful. That's great. So talking about SIL and SDA, why do you feel that it is essential to separate SIL and SDA? Or maybe not even you. Why does the government say that they should be separate?
Yeah, it's one of those ones. It's an interesting one because I feel like I've been banging on about this for 4 years in saying that you should be separating SIL and SDA, and that any day now it's going to be enforced. but it's one of those things that that the NDIA has been really on about since day dot. Their position has always been, and the underpinning of that position is that choice and control remains this paramount ideal. And by putting your SDA and SIL in one provider, effectively you're taking away that choice about who you receive supports from. Because when we sort of look at it, and this tends to be the view of the NDIA, when we look at a property and selecting housing under SDA, that's intended to be realistically a long-term support. It's something that isn't really going to shift. It's something that's going to sit there very stable, so that disabled people have somewhere to live and aren't sort of forced to move around to find alternatives in support. But with SIL, it can be a lot more changeable, I guess. There's that ability for it to shift. Not so much at a moment's notice, but definitely in a shorter time frame than you would expect someone to shift their housing. So keeping those two ideas separate, the support within the house and the house itself, is sort of seen as that important step by the NDIA in ensuring that there's that choice and control that can be sort of maintained for participants.
Yeah. So we saw again that, I mean, they have talked about it for a long time, and it was in the NDIS review that it was again recommended. Do you think we're likely to see it actually legislated?
From a view of people wanting it, absolutely. I think it's an any day sort of thing. As much as I say I've been banging on about it for 4 years, it's more comes down to government actually putting it into legislation. That I think continues to be sort of the step that is missing here. And that review, there was clearly an appetite. There's clearly been a government appetite when it came down 12 months ago to bring it into force. But the first step has been so slow to getting here. and with an election face next year, you just can't know at this stage
Yeah.
as to when it might come. It could turn around and they could release a slew of packages to go in before the election. Whoever wins the next one, they could make it a priority. We just don't know as to what sort of reform we're going to see coming up with the NDIS and with the NDIS Act in particular. But it's definitely one of those that, the NDIA has flagged and continues to flag as something that they see as important. And so, there's an ability to ignore it, which some providers have chosen to do at this stage. And again, there's been no ill effect to that. So there is nothing wrong with that at the moment. But it is something where we're moving, however slowly it might be, we are moving to a phase where there is going to be a need to have that separation. And now it's a question of what form that separation takes. Is it going to just be, a separation of you can have two separate entities under the same parent who can provide, or is it going to be they have to be absolutely separated entities with no conflicts? For my view, it's probably more going to be the first one that we see as sort of the main model for where people are looking to sort of provide. But there's going to need to be a split, or at least a presentable split to the NDIA. And with most things under the NDIS, there's going to be an element of discretion, I would say.
Yeah.
Like we're looking at a space where they're going to need to be able to say, under our discretion, we're going to say that this is too close, or that this is fine. It's going to come down to whatever the NDIA sort of views it as. This would be my view. And look, they may go a different way. But just with everything we've seen from the NDIA during their lifetime, this I would say would be the most likely way they'd want to enforce things.
And that seems to be, as you said, providers seem to be having separate entities, but they have common directorship and, they don't have any independent people. They have, I own this company and my wife owns that company, but they might both be owned by a trust or, something like that, or they have common directors across both companies. How does that reduce the conflict?
This is the problem inherently, is that on paper, it puts them into separate entities and it's easier to remove. The basic point of removing the entities is so that we can say, hypothetically, that if there's an issue with the SIL, that one company can be removed without also requiring the removal of the SDA.
Yeah.
So it's sort of removing and putting those into two separate baskets that are easier to move in and out. Now, in terms of actual enforcement and what that looks like, it doesn't make it that much easier, because you do end up in a space where it is still all these properties will be built, these SILs will come in, and unless there's a very, very strict conflict of interest and there's some very well enforced walls between the two entities, you are going to end up in a space where there may be some hesitance to remove a SIL. And then does that become an issue for the NDIA? Do they have to step in? What happens? Again, a lot of this is just in the space of we don't know.
Yeah.
But when they bring it in, it's sort of the inevitable thing will be that there'll be something in there that allows the NDIA to make a decision, I would say.
Yeah.
And look, this is all speculation at this stage. We have nothing to go on other than a desire in very broad terms for them to be separate entities.
Yeah.
The specifics of that is just unknown.
Yeah.
But it would seem, if one man's opinion, it would seem to be that the NDIA will want the ability to deal with issues where there may be that conflict that arises and to make a call. Because there may be some who are very well, who are very well behaved. There may be some entities out there who create their two separate entities providing SDA and SIL, put their SIL in, and then happily move them on if necessary. And they're not a problem, and the NDIA may take no issue with that. But there may be others who are causing problems, and the NDIA will want to step in.
Yeah.
So it's going to come down to how it's managed on an individual level, I would say, because from a top down, having the ability to remove one entity without removing the other is the ideal, but how well that's affected will be sort of the deciding factor as to whether the NDIA steps in. That would be my assessment.
Yeah, because the other element to it is the NDIS Practice Standards require NDIS providers to have collaboration agreements in place between SIL and SDA providers.
Yeah, that's right.
At what point does that collaboration agreement create a conflict of interest if, again, that separation if the SIL provider, if the SDA provider only uses that SIL provider and there's exclusivity there in their collaboration agreement, isn't that also creating a relationship that could cause a conflict?
Yeah, well, this is sort of the interesting issue with just the overall structure, because there is that need for that collaboration agreement, and from a top down idealized world sort of view, it probably is the intention that those agreements are how we work together in a property, not so much how the relationship that we share, but how we ensure that we work together to provide the participants with the best support, the best housing, and that we inform each other where there are issues so that they can be resolved. That's sort of the top down. And for a lot of those agreements, that is the very fuzzy language that you'll see at the front of each of these. But you're right in that a number of properties, and we do this a lot, I have to admit, it is one of these structures that is implemented, but a lot of properties will have structures whereby if one resident wishes to remove a SIL, that might not be an automatic trigger. You'll end up with a position where it requires a majority of people in the property. And what's interesting, looking at the independent review, is that their position in the independent review was that there should be some level of conformity between people receiving supports in a house, that we should be looking at a position where people are sharing their supports in a house. But you can't do that if everybody's got separate SILs.
Yeah.
So even from that view, there is something to that sort of idea of a majority decision in house and giving, I guess, a greater level of certainty to a SIL that doesn't necessarily allow them to just be removed where one resident is unhappy, or to completely throw out the sort of financial balance in the house.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of an issue really that isn't resolved yet. And again, we've seen before attempts to come in and patch the legislation for the amend the legislation for the NDIS Act to sort of make the changes that government wants to see to be done very haphazardly in a way where they do leave holes that we're still grappling with.
It's an understatement.
Yeah, absolutely. But and this may just be another one of those. It's sort of hard to know. And again, either they come in with a very light touch, give discretion to the NDIA, and then all of this becomes a little bit of a very murky area for providers where you're having to enter into these arrangements, but realistically, if people want you out, you have to kind of jump quick with expecting that there's a risk that you might be pushed.
Yeah.
Or you come in really hard and it becomes very clear, but there's no room to move. There's no room to innovate.
Yeah.
Similar to what we see a lot these days. As much as the NDIS sets down very clearly what you can't do, it doesn't leave a lot of room for innovation in what you can do.
Yeah.
Because you've got to sort of abide by those guidelines.
Yeah. So as we currently stand, you are allowed to be both the SIL and the SDA provider.
Yep.
We're thinking it may move to a model where they at least need to be separate entities, but could have common ownership maybe. Or they just talk about how they're going to manage those conflicts and have, robust processes in place.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting evolution. I wonder, so the NDIS Practice Standards isn't a legislative document. It's a guideline underneath the Act. Surely it would be really simple to add something to the practice standards. Like the practice standards already say, you have to do a review of it. You have to have a collaboration agreement. You need to manage conflicts of interest. Surely they could just add a point to that just says there needs to be, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the wording.
Separate two entities, something like that.
Two entities.
I mean, I don't think that's wrong, to be honest. The issue, and look, it's probably something you ask the NDIA as to why they haven't gone down that pathway, given that there's been this clear position on this.
Yeah.
Again, hazarding a guess at this stage, it seems to be, where those positions are there, they're sort of very to a certain extent, there's not a lot of room for disagreement, I suppose.
Yeah.
To say that, you need to manage conflicts, you need to set out complaints process, you need to deal with privacy. Things down that sort of list are very clear, and if they are challenged, there's an ability for the NDIA to at least be fairly certain that when it goes and deals with those challenges, that it will come out on top.
Yeah.
Putting in something that requires those entities to be separate where it's not required elsewhere, and particularly where where there are multiple providers out there who will be registered to provide multiple different services.
Yeah.
And there's nothing under legislation that separates anybody else except for this one.
Yeah.
It's difficult to sort of
Makes sense.
make that enforceable.
Mm.
And for the NDIA, if they lose that and it's not enforceable,
Yeah.
then it becomes even harder to make it work in the future.
Yeah.
So
makes a lot of sense.
I think not putting it down and not sort of trying to enforce it allows the NDIA to just, stand over the top and sort of waggle their finger at everybody, when something doesn't look right until it's changed.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got something there, they then have to defend it. And I'm not sure that under the current legislation, that's as easy as it seems.
Because from my perspective as an NDIS auditor, all we audit are the practice standards, and that's the only ongoing review or ongoing enforcement of anything is done at a lower level. It doesn't get to the NDIS Commission or the NDIA necessarily unless you have broken the law and someone reports you. But as an auditor, you have to have an audit, a SIL provider every 18 months, a SDA provider every 3 years. They're audited. So every 3 years we're checking for conflicts. We're talking to them about conflicts. So it seems to me it would make sense to be there. But you're right. If there's not a legislative instrument above it, then it would be hard if they challenged it or went to the AAT or whatever the steps are.
Look, I think there's an ability there to an extent, and it's just how you use it from a certain point of view. So, for example, we've seen before, historically, this doesn't really happen anymore, but there was some SDA providers who would require SILs to make license payments to be able to reside within a property, to use the OA spaces. There were those sort of obligations. The NDIS effectively stamped that out by refusing to certify or threatening the registration of people who are using those methods on the basis that it would breach choice and control, because it puts a block on a participant's ability to select the SIL they want if that SIL is then required to pay money they shouldn't otherwise be required to pay. Yeah. And I think from a certain point of view, if they're looking to enforce it here, if something is egregious, it comes down at the moment more to where they can't remove a SIL, where you're in that position where because they're the SDA, they just refuse to remove the SIL. If there's a complaint, if there's an issue, there's nothing stopping the NDIA from again saying, well, your registration's under risk. You need to resolve this issue. You need to remove that SIL because at the moment you're in breach of their choice and control. You're in breach of the practice guidelines by refusing to provide them the service they're looking for. There's plenty of ways to deal with that under the current system. It's not just set out clearly and fundamentally as, at a basic level, you can't be the two entities. Yeah. I think that is something that you want to see out of legislation, really. Yeah. Because there needs to be that clarity. Otherwise, we end up in a position where, if somebody down the road get a new NDIA commissioner in, they decide they don't like other services being provided by the same entity, suddenly everybody's got to split up. And companies that exist and entities that exist now to provide these services and provide them without incident are being forced to split themselves into all sorts of shapes to make that work. Or otherwise, again, things are being appealed, which may backfire on the NDIA itself.
Yeah. So I know we've been talking about conflict of interest a lot. Can you explain what a conflict of interest actually is?
Yeah, well, conflict of interest is where effectively it's a concept where you have two competing interests. Sounds very obvious. You have two competing interests that you can't realistically control. You can't deal with both of them at the same time. So again, where you're an SDA and a SIL, where you're the SDA, you want people in the property to be receiving the right support. But you as the SIL want to keep providing supports to everyone in a property. That can be considered a conflict because they're sort of they're at conflict by just providing, by providing the housing and wanting to provide housing that ensures people are happy. That may go up against a SIL who ultimately also wants to provide supports. But if there's an issue, suddenly you've got those two competing interests that you have to kind of balance. You're wearing both the hats, and who do you have your duties to? Yeah. Ultimately, they're all to the participant, but equally on a corporate level, you've got a duty to your company to make sure that you're receiving the right amount of funding in a property to actually make it cost effective. Yeah. You've got a right to potential investors or to your own employees to make sure that the company stays, in that property, keeps receiving support, keeps making the money it's supposed to make. Yep. But that's in competition with what a participant wants and potentially what an SDA wants. So when we talk about conflicts, it's down to that level. It's am I solely looking at you, participant, and thinking of your interests and inside my own corporate bubble? Or do I have other interests with other providers that may conflict with you?
Yeah.
Mm.
I find that providers get very confused about what a conflict of interest is.
Mm.
Not so much SDA providers, but sometimes SIL providers and other providers. I find that they have this impression that either they have no idea or they don't understand the concept at all of conflict of interest, or if they do, they just feel like you can't have a conflict. But you can have a conflict, you just have to manage it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. You just have to be able to manage that process.
Yeah.
Looking at it from a SIL perspective, again, providing that sort of on-site support, there are supports you may provide, and you may have, for example, you may have an arm that runs an OT service that you are connected to. And you say to your participant, I've got this fantastic OT service, you should use them, and they choose to do so initially. That is potentially a conflict at that stage.
Yeah.
Because you're providing them with both these services, and if they decide they don't want one, well, you as the SIL, that's to your benefit to push them back towards yourselves. So what you want to have really is just clear guidelines in place that say where that conflict happens. Either whoever the relevant people involved with that are step out and we approach it from a top-down view of these separate entities. Or if it's all the same group providing it, you just need to be clear on, for the most part, following what the participant wants to do at that stage. There will be some instances where that's not clear, but from an initial point of view, you really do want to go, okay, well, this is what the participant wants. How do we make that work in a way that's going to work for everybody? And ultimately, if it can't work for everybody, you're probably going to need to look at moving more towards the participant's needs than other higher corporate needs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great way of seeing it. It's around how are we always making sure that the participant is first in this. And I guess to evidence that, you could do things like get independent people involved, whether they're advocates, family members, and rely upon other third-party advice around what's actually going to minimize this conflict or remove it as much as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the best ways to go with trying to deal with conflict. Removing yourself or removing sort of that decision from one entity and splitting it out as much as possible is the best way to sort of deal with things. Because ultimately, in this space, you're providing support to people who have a high level of need, who are at risk really of potential abuse from all sorts of sides. And so you have this massive fiduciary duty to these people to make sure that they are looked after. And so that's really the reason for the large concern here is how do we, how do we ensure that there's not that risk? How do we sort of keep that in line? And that's sort of where we look at, sort of go off topic a bit, but talking about like restrictive practices, things of that nature, where there's a potential for abuse. There's a need to have policies, very clear guidelines and very clear reporting in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. And that ultimately is what a conflict of interest is at a very, slightly more aggressive way of describing it, but it is still that, risk of potential abuse there that you need to deal with. And that's how you should really consider it, I'd say.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation. What are the best practice ways that providers can minimize or ensure a proper separation between SIL and SDA?
I mean, look, as has been said before, at a very basic level, separate entities is a fantastic start.
Yeah.
Because it does give you, those sort of separate corporate interests to an extent. And it's much easier at that stage to, on a corporate level, to go, okay, well, this isn't working out with this SIL entity. We're going to move it somewhere else. We're going to do something else with it. Where it's all bundled up, all of your financial decisions will be based on having both in a property.
Right.
And it becomes a lot harder to look at that from a view of, okay, we need to remove this.
Right.
So that's really the first case. And then otherwise, as we sort of said, really clear conflict guidelines. Your agreements with your provider, with your participants should absolutely be saying that there is a conflict there's a potential for conflict, or at the very least that, the people providing the accommodation are also providing the supports.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, because being honest in that way sort of puts you ahead of it already because, the participant knows, their advocates know. And if they don't think you're doing something right, they will very quickly call you on it.
Yeah. Right.
Which, offers all sorts of issues, absolutely. But also it allows you to a certain extent to be in front of it.
Mm.
Because if you go through a pathway of hiding that and of making a decision that ultimately is seen to be in conflict, if a participant finds out after the fact, that's going to be a lot worse than sort of trying to make a decision up front and them saying, well, I think there's an issue here. We don't agree with this. We think you're in conflict. And dealing with that up front, that's a lot less stakes than trying to deal with it after the fact.
Yeah.
So setting those out is absolutely sort of key. And from an internal level, having different people managing the processes is important. So I wouldn't say you want to have employees who are providing both the SDA and the SIL service in the property. You want to have an appropriate property manager managing the property who is separate from whoever is managing the SIL.
Right.
And that's not to say they can't, be managing SIL in a separate property or they can't be doing something different. But fundamentally, having different people managing those situations will give you the best chance of keeping those conflicts separate because they will approach their job from different positions rather than sort of how do I do both things at once.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. That's great. So we've talked a little bit about what a conflict is. We've talked about the need for the separation, some of the challenges and some of the best practices. Is there anything else you think that a SIL or an SDA provider needs to know when they're considering the best way to navigate the separation or the conflict of interest?
Yeah, I think we've sort of covered off most of it. At this stage, as we sort of touched on at the start, there really is a move towards setting out what this should look like. So keeping an ear to the ground, making sure you're aware and, listening into fine broadcasts such as this for further information is a great way to start and to keep that sort of knowledge there. In terms of managing it on a day-to-day basis, you just need to a certain extent be honest with yourself as to how you're managing participants. Because ultimately what we're dealing with here is their choice and control, ensuring that they're not at risk. You really need to focus in, and if you are potentially facing conflict and you feel there's an issue arising, fundamentally you need to go back to that participant's point of view and sort of say, okay, how do I view this from a participant's point of view? How am I doing this right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say participants are right in every case, but there is something to be considered around that. And again, there is room to move, as I sort of said earlier on. For properties where you're trying to provide multiple, you're trying to provide SIL to multiple people in the property, there is an ability to say, okay, well, I have one person who's unhappy. That's not enough to remove a SIL from an entire property where it's based on a shared model. Therefore, that person, has to resolve the issue for themselves.
Right.
And that's not based on the fact that I'm one person in the middle. That's based on sort of a higher decision around all the participants in the property.
Right.
Because and perhaps that's the thing really to come back to with this. As much as you do want to look at what the participant's view is, you want to fundamentally protect the participant's choice of control.
Yeah.
That shouldn't also negatively impact other people in the property.
Yeah, right.
So it's one of those things to keep in mind as to what your property is and how what a decision you make will impact everybody. Because if you can't continue to provide SIL to the 3 or 4 people who are happy with you, because you need to leave for the one person who's not, that may not be an appropriate outcome for those other people who are now left high and dry.
Yeah.
So it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's never going to be easy, unfortunately. But at this stage, it really just is, best practice. Look at your standards, look at the guidelines, and view it through that lens as to what will this be in compliance with everything. That's about the best you can do at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. If there is anyone listening today who wants to reach out and talk to you more about anything to do with their SIL or SDA business, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Absolutely. They can give me an email on Jackson, Jackson, .Dyer, DYER, at DLAPiper.com. And that's probably the best way. Otherwise, again, just DLA Piper website, dlapiper.com.au. Just have a look. Apologies, dlapiper.com would be the best place to go and find other contact information.
Perfect. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on this episode of SILosophy. If this resonated with you, take a second to subscribe and share it with someone in the SIL space who really needs to hear this. Don't forget to connect with Tania Gomez Consulting on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for more resources, conversations, and support to help you grow your impact. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep making a difference.